Hi class. So, as I promised, we had video 1, video 2, now we're at video 3, and this is all about equilibrium. So we're still in chapter 4, we're still talking about the market forces of supply and demand. So, video 1 was about demand, video 2 was on by supply, and now we're going to put the two together and we're going to get the equilibrium. So what is the equilibrium? The equilibrium is when you start to look at the forces of supply and the forces of demand, and you look at where they intersect. The price that has reached the level where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So for in this case, here we are, and here is the quantity supplied. And as we know from what we created earlier, quantity supplied has a positive relationship between price. So as the price goes up, what happens? They have a direct relationship, the quantity goes up. We know the quantity demanded has the opposite relationship. As the price goes down, we know the quantity demanded goes up, and as the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. So we created these two market demand curves. Remember, we used two people to create the market demand curve for lattes, and we created two companies to create the quantity supplied curve for lattes as well. And we know that at the price 0, we can graph the demand curve. So at price 0, the demand is 24. So there's 0, there's the price 0. And then the quantity demanded was 24 right there. So we can plot that point. And then we can say at 1, it was 21. We can plot that point. And at 2, it was 18. So we can plot that point. And then we can create our curve for demand. And then we can do the same thing for supply. We could say at 0, it's 0. At 1, it's 5. At 2, it's 10, etc. And we can plot this curve. Where the two intersect becomes the equilibrium. This is where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. In this particular case, on the graph, we can see this is a 15 and a price of $3. We can see on the table that it is 3, and the quantity demanded is 15, and the quantity supplied is 15. Now, let's go back to our chocolate bars. For the chocolate bars, what we're going to find is exactly the same thing. So what we're going to look at is that the quantity demanded, just like we did before, and we're going to look at all the different quantities across the consumers that we're purchasing. And we know at $2, they demanded 100. At $1.60, they demanded 200. At $2.20, they demanded 300. At $80, they demanded 400. And at $40, they demanded 500. Now, over here, we can do the same thing for the supply. So we know at 200, they demanded 500. At 160, they demanded 400. At 120, they demanded 300. At 80, they supplied 200. And at 40, they supplied 100. This represents the supply curve. And as the price went down, the quantity supplied went down. As the price went down, what happened here is the quantity supplied actually went up, right? This number is bigger than this number, which is bigger than this number, which is bigger than this number, which is bigger than this number. The quantity demanded has an inverse relationship with the price. The quantity supplied has a direct relationship with the price. Now, to find the equilibrium, you need to find out where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. And that happens at 300. So the equilibrium price becomes what? 120. And the equilibrium quantity becomes 300. That means that at that price, consumers would demand exactly the same amount as the producers produce. No extra, no shortage, right? Ideal situation for an economy. So the equilibrium price is the price in which the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are equal. So if we look at this on a graph, we've graphed the demand just like we did before. And we came up with this nice line here where we've looked at every single price point and how much has been demanded. And then we've looked at the supply curve and we've graphed that. And where they cross, X marks the spot, believe it or not, will be hopefully at exactly the same point as it is on the table. When we look at the lattes, exactly the same thing occurs here. You're taking the quantity demanded, the quantity supplied, and you're coming up with exactly the same thing on the graph. Whereas we know that $3 is a number that we saw when we looked at it on the chart, we now can see it on the graph. So what happens if the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded? So what happens if the market decides that instead of producing at a price of $3, which we know to be the equilibrium, they instead say, oh no, we're going to go to $5. Look what happens. So at $5, there's your demand. How do you figure out what the quantity demanded is? You drop down from the demand curve, straight down, preferably straight, not the line, and you can figure out your quantity demanded. Believe it or not, that's 9. You go over, and you just it's the same thing on the supply curve, and you go straight down, and that is the quantity supplied. So in this particular case, at $5, the quantity demanded is 9 lattes. See over here on the curve, and the quantity supplied is 25. So if you take the larger number, subtract the smaller number, in this case 25 minus 9, you're going to result in a surplus, a difference between how much consumers are willing to buy, the demand, and how much the suppliers are willing to supply, the supply quantity supply curve. The surplus, that difference, that gap is 16 lattes. So how do we handle this? Now remember back to the good old invisible hands? Well, the invisible hand comes into play here because the invisible hand still affects everything. So what happens is, as they face a surplus, the sellers try to increase sales by cutting price. So what are they going to do? They're going to say, okay, well, I started off and I was at $5 and I couldn't sell as many as I wanted. So what am I going to do? Well, if here I am at $5, yeah, I want to sell 25, but look, consumers are only buying 8. What am I going to, no, 9. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to need to reduce my price. And this is where you start to see the price reductions that we all see. So they reduce their price to 4 and they see what their gap is. Now where are they? They've reduced their price to 4. So now all of a sudden now the quantity supplied is going to be 20 and the quantity demanded is going to be 11. So we've reduced the surplus. Now if we take it one step further, you can start to see that they have to keep reducing their price. So they were at $4, they were at $5. Remember, that's where we started. Then we went to $4 and we still had a surplus. So now we have to reduce it again to $3. When they reduce it to $3, now we're back to equilibrium. So what we're saying is the prices continue to fall until the market price reaches equilibrium. This concept is called the invisible hand. The invisible hand is pushing down the price, like a hand pushing down the price until it reaches equilibrium. Remember back to what chapter was that? Anybody remember? Well, that's what we're doing. Shortage is the opposite. It's an excess demand. So what we've done is now we've done the opposite. We have a price and a quantity in such a way that we literally don't have enough. So now the price is $2. Here's the supply, and here's the demand, here's the supply. So what has happened is that we started off, started off down here. I'm sorry about that. We started off, every time I click on it, it's changing me. Sorry about that. So we started off with a shortage. So at $1, 5 were going to be produced because the price is pretty low. And oh, well, consumers say, well, if the pot price is $5, I want 20. So we have a shortage of how much? 15. So the market forces are going to do what? They're going to push the price upward. As they push the price upward, what happens is the quantity demanded starts to fall. Why does the quantity demanded start to fall? As the price goes up, remember, price is inversely related to demand. So as the price gets higher, the quantity demanded goes slower. So now we went from 20 to slightly less than 20, which this is 15, 16, 17, 18. So now we're at 18-ish. And well, the price is higher now, so the suppliers say, oh, I'll produce 10. So we've reduced the shortage. What do you think happens next? Yeah, anybody guess that the invisible hand's at work here? Yeah, it is. The invisible hand will have the price continue to increase until it reaches, so the invisible hands, imagine it, it's right there. It's pushing up the price until it reaches the equilibrium. We're making market adjustments. So a shortage is when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Thus, there's an excess demand. Because there's an excess demand, prices have to go up to basically bring the demand back in line. So shortages occur when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. A shortage. We want more than there is available. In other words, mathematically speaking, QD is greater than QS. A surplus occurs when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. In other words, just too much out there and people don't want it. And that means that the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. In the case of our chocolates, where the equilibrium we knew to be what? The price of 120 and 300. Anything above here creates a surplus. In other words, what happens? Quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded because the price is higher. And anything below creates a what? A shortage, because now the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And you can see the math here to calculate the surplus and the shortage. For instance, if the supplied is greater, for instance, at over here, at $2, the quantity demanded is only 100. The quantity supplied is 500. So 500 minus 100 is 400. So what factors shift them both or one? And how does the equilibrium change? Well, the equilibrium can change if the supply curve shifts, if the demand curve shifts, or both shift. So in order to figure out what to do, you need to first off figure out whether the event shifts the supply or the demand curve or both. Then, just like before, you need to decide whether it's going to shift it outward or inward, right or left. And then using the supply and demand curve, you can start to see how that shift affects the equilibrium. So here's the market for hybrid carbs. There's a price, there's a supply, there's a demand. P, Q. So if there's an increase in the price of gas, okay, gas is used by consumers to run cars. So what would happen if the price of gas went up? Hybrid cars become more what? Attractive. So if they become more attractive, then the demand at any price point will shift outward. So as the demand shifts outward, there's a new demand curve in red. This now, when we look at the graph, means that we end up with a new price and a new quantity. How do we figure it out? X marks the spot. Nothing happened to the supply curve because the price of gas just made consumers want more. It didn't necessarily mean the producers were producing more. So in this particular case, what this means is that you have a new equilibrium. Right there, X marks the spot, in which you have an increase in your price and a slight increase in the demand, or the quantity demanded, right? So the quantity demanded went up and the price went up. Now this did happen during the last time gas prices went up. Why? Because consumers thought to themselves, oh, well, a hybrid for my particular situation would work. And thus they bought hybrids. That makes total sense. Sorry, I've temporarily lost my mouse. There he is. There he is. And now we've got him back. All right. So what happens in this example is literally that the price has risen because the producers are obviously going to produce more on their supply curve. They haven't shifted their supply curve, but because the price is higher, they can produce more. This is where we run into some issues because immediately everyone thinks, well, the producers are going to get more money, the supply curve is going to shift off. If you remember correctly, price is not a shift factor. Remember, the only things that shift price are non-price determinants. So even though by shifting the demand curve, producers are going to make more and sell more, doesn't mean that they're going to shift their supply curve. This is kind of why advertising works, right? All right, let's say there's a new technology that reduces the cost of producing hybrid cars. Now, you all of a sudden read that, producing anything, the technology that reduces the cost of producing, changes an input. Anytime it changes any of the inputs or any of the technologies, immediately that should go to, okay, this is on the supply side. Because it's on the supply side, now I got to figure out what it's going to do. If technology reduces the cost, that means that they can make more at the same price points as before, but they can make more. So that's going to shift the supply curve outward. First thing you need to decide. So we know it's a supply curve. We know it's going to shift right. Now what happened there? Now you've got to look to see on a graph what's going to happen. So if the supply curve shifts to the right, demand stayed exactly the same in this particular case. So we started with price 1 and quantity 1, and we're going to move to price 2, the new equilibrium, and quantity 2. So what's happened? Price has gone down, and the quantity has gone up. So if you were the federal government and you wanted more cars to be sold, hybrids, you can do one of two things. You could artificially increase the price of gas, although that probably would not be a wise thing to do. Consumers might get mad. Or you can help with technology or supporting patents that might make hybrid cars cheaper. If you make hybrid cars cheaper to make, then the supply will go up and you will reduce the cost of producing them. The supply curve will go out, the price will go down, more consumers will probably buy them, as we see here, and what happens? Hopefully the greenhouse gas effect will be less. So this is where you start to see policy and economics come very closely together. So this is what an economist would say. Economists would say to a policymaker, okay, you want to increase the overall quantity of hybrid cars purchased in the United States because that will reduce our greenhouse gases and maybe make us more in accordance with the Paris Accord or whatever we're trying to do. All right, Well, you can do one of two things. You can either work on why consumers, the demand curve, which might be harder. You could give them a tax incentive, that would work. Or you can give it to new technology and help them maybe support it, maybe some patents, maybe some reduction in cost, maybe an incentive, and all of a sudden you can shift the supply curve. Okay, what if these both happen? Okay, so there's a price reduction, there's a price increase in gas. Oh my gosh, this happens all the time, right? We've all lived through this. And there's a technology reduction in the production costs. Okay, so price of gas. Okay, price of gas, who does that affect? That affects the person who is driving a car, so that would affect demand. New technologies, okay, that's going to affect the production costs. Okay, it's going to shift both curves. So you got to shift the consumer curve right there. There's the consumer curve. You got to shift that one to the right. And you also have to shift the supply curve. So what ends up happening is that you move both curves and you end up with a brand new equilibrium with brand new supply curve and brand new demand curve. The price is actually slightly higher, but the quantity is quite a bit higher. So quantity is going to rise. And the price did increase, but very smallly. So if the demand increases more than the supply, then the price will rise. But if the demand doesn't increase more than the supply, then you could actually have your price stay the same and quantity go out. In this particular case, you can see that we have made the price go up because we have made what? We made the demand curve shift more than we made the supply curve. Because we made the demand curve shift more than the supply curve, that did what? That made the price a little bit higher than it was before. If the demand curve and the supply curve were shifted about the same, then you might not have seen much price difference, but you would have seen a quantity difference. Now, what if the same thing happened, but the supply increased drastically more than the demand? So the price of gas wasn't enough to make people want hybrid. Maybe it was because of the distance they could go. Maybe it was because the cars weren't big enough to do what they needed them to do. There's so many things that can affect consumers, right? Tastes and preferences. So the supply went really high and the demand didn't. Now P1 is higher than P2. So in essence, what's happened is that the consumers want more and they got a lower price, both of which can happen. So in terms of shift versus movement along the curve, you remember these things. A change in supply. That's a shift of the supply curve. And that can only happen with what? Non-price determinants. So if I say something with the word price in it, you have to immediately assume what? It is a price determinant, not a non-price determinant. If I say the word price, it's not a shift factor. It is literally moving along the curve. A non-price determinant is what shifts the curve. Technology, cost of inputs, those types of things. Change in the quantity supplied. So literally shifting the supply curve. I'm sorry. A change in quantity supplied is literally moving along the supply curve. I'm sorry. I was thinking the next slide along. I was getting over anxious. Change in demand is a shift in the demand curve that occurs from non-price determinants. Income, number of buyers, substitutions. A change in the quantity demanded literally means you move along the demand curve because of price. So let me say this again because I got us all confused. Change in supply. You actually are going to shift the supply curve, right? Non-price determinants. A change in quantity supply just means I was here and now I'm here. Same curve. The change in demand means that something happens to the demand curve. What? Could be income of the consumers, it could be the number of buyers, it could be consumer preferences, all those non-price determinants. A change in the quantity demanded, you stay on the same curve, and what happened? Just because price changed, price went up, quantity demanded went down. So let's practice this. Remember our CDs and our music downloads? We're going to look at 3 different events. The first one is we had the supply and the demand curve, and we had a nice little equilibrium going there. And right there we are. I've decided to go. Sorry about that. So here we are. So here we are at the first price. And the mouse has decided to go renegade, sorry. Software is delicious, isn't it? And it's also a pain in the butt. So here we are. Price 1, quantity 1. Great! X marks the spot, we're all set. Now, the market for music downloads, there was a fall in the price. So now CDs are what? A substitute for music downloads. Because CDs are cheaper, consumers are going to move away from music downloads to CDs. That means that the demand curve for music downloads shifted to the right. When it shifted to the right, you get a new equilibrium. When you get a new equilibrium, you move to P2 and you move to Q2. The quantity went down when the price went down. If we think about our behavior, that makes sense. If we move away from one thing to another, it would make sense that the price would probably end up going down and the quantity would go down. But chances are we've moved to CDs because they are even more attractive to us. Now, what happens if there's royalties? So what are royalties? They are the costs of a music download. They're what has to be paid to an artist. So there are costs and input costs, because if you think about it from a perspective of producing a music download, you get the music, but you have to pay the artist each time you download the music. So in that case, the supply curve has done what? It has moved, because what has happened? The royalty cost went down. So now I can, at every price point, I can supply more. I can shift my entire supply curve because one of my input costs, royalties, and input costs has gone down. So I shift my supply curve. So I used to be at one price. Now my price goes down and my quantity goes up. What if both curves shift? So the demand curve shifts because we found that the price of CDs fell. So that means the demand for music downloads went down. And the fall in the cost of royalties meant that the supply curve shifted right. Well, if they both, this gets back to this whole notion of if they both fall about the same, you may have an ambiguous effect. And this is where graphing comes in real handy, doesn't it? Because without the graphing, you don't really know what it looks like, do you? So on the side of your paper or on a piece of paper, it's always okay. Sorry, that is a terrible graph. Let's try that again. It is always okay to draw. So if you say to yourself, okay, well, the demand curve shifted in and the supply curve shifted out, where did I end up? Here's where I started, here's where I ended. Oh, look, the Q barely moved. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with taking a look to see where you're going to end up. So, in conclusion, remember how we talked about the whole notion of markets being a good way to organize activity. Well, we just talked about supply and demand. And supply and demand is the market for goods and services from the consumer and the supplier. And the equilibrium prices are literally the signals that guide economic decisions and thereby allocate resources. So consumers are sending signals to manufacturers by what they're willing to buy at every price point. And manufacturers are sending signals to the market saying, this is what I'm willing to produce at every price point. So remember, there are In a competitive market, there are many buyers and many sellers, each of which has very little influence on the market price. So we're talking about a market where there are a lot of different options. Economists use these supply and demand models to obviously analyze these markets. The downward sloping demand curve reflects the law of demand, which states as a quantity buyers demand depends negatively on the price. In other words, as the price goes up, buyers buy less. As the price goes down, buyers buy more. So beside price, demand does depend on what we call the non-price determinants. These are the things that shift the curves. Buyers' incomes, tastes and expectations, prices of substitutes and complements, the number of buyers. If any of these factors change, the curve's going to shift. But if price is the only thing that changes, we stay on the curve. Now, the upward sloping supply curve reflects the law of supply, which states that as the quantity supplier supply depends positively on the goods price. The more sellers will sell more as the price goes up. So what are the other determinants of supply? Well, price will move you along the supply curve, whereas other things such as input prices, technology, expectations, the number of sellers will shift the curve one way or another. So, we use these supply and demand diagrams to analyze the effects of any event on the market. First, determine the event shifts, which curves. Then we determine the direction of the shift. So is it demand? Is it supply? Are there two things happening? And then thirdly, we look at the new equilibrium. Prices are signals that guide economic decisions and allocate our scarce resources. That is it, guys. You have now completed chapter 4. Complete your notes and then move on to chapter 5.